The old barn on the edge of Lawson County had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. By 2002, it was nothing more than a decaying relic, its roof sagging inward, wooden walls warped from years of rain and snow. When developers purchased the land at auction, they planned to tear it down within the week. No one expected the barn to hold anything more than moldy hay and rusted tools. But on a cold March morning, a demolition worker's crowbar splintered through a false wall, revealing something that would stop the crew in their tracks. A rusted bicycle, its red paint dulled to brown, wedged into a sealed cavity. Dust billowed into the air as a decades-old paper root bag slipped to the floor, spilling brittle newspapers dated July 3, 1983. The foreman called the sheriff's office immediately. Within an hour, the barn was surrounded by yellow tape and deputies picking through rotted timber with gloved hands. To the town of Lawson, the discovery wasn't just shocking, it was personal. The name etched faintly into the bike's frame was one everyone remembered: Ethan Walsh. 19 years earlier, Ethan had vanished without a trace. He was only 13 years old. A quiet boy with an easy smile who spent his summer mornings riding his paper route before breakfast. It was supposed to be like any other Sunday. He loaded up his bag with neatly folded copies of the Lawson Gazette, waved goodbye to his father, and pedaled down County Road 8 at dawn. He never came back. Back in 1983, the disappearance had shattered the small farming town. Lawson wasn't the kind of place where children vanished. The Walsh family lived in a modest clapboard house on the edge of Main Street. Ethan's father, Charles Walsh, worked nights at the local feed mill, and his mother, Joanne, was a nurse's aide at the county clinic. Ethan was their only child. Neighbors described him as dependable, never missed a delivery, never strayed from his route. That's why it was so strange when, by mid-morning, the stack of undelivered newspapers was found dumped beside a fence line 3 miles from his house. His bike was nowhere in sight. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw him after he turned off Maple Avenue. The sheriff's department launched a search that lasted weeks. Volunteers combed cornfields, drained irrigation ditches, and scoured abandoned farmhouses. Bloodhounds were brought in, but lost the scent near an old property owned by the Thompson brothers, a pair of reclusive farmers notorious for bar fights and cattle disputes. Still, without physical evidence, suspicion fizzled out. The case went cold by winter. The Walsh family never recovered. Charles spent years pinning missing posters on telephone poles long after they yellowed from rain, while Joanne lit a candle in the church window every July 3rd, praying for answers that never came. When the rusted bicycle was pulled from the barn wall in 2002, those prayers seemed on the verge of being answered. The news spread through Lawson like wildfire. Old-timers who had helped search for Ethan stood at the property line, hats in hand, watching deputies swarm the site. Detective Laura Keating, newly promoted and barely 30, took lead on the reopened case. She was a child when Ethan vanished, but she remembered the fear that gripped the town, the way parents stopped letting kids ride alone, how everyone locked their doors for the first time. To her, this wasn't just another case, it was the town's biggest ghost. The barn itself was a time capsule. Layers of dust coated everything. Rusted farming tools leaned in corners like forgotten skeletons. As investigators pried apart the wallboards, they realized the bicycle hadn't been abandoned carelessly. It had been hidden. Nails had been driven from the inside out, sealing the compartment tight. Alongside the bike lay remnants of Ethan's paper bag, brittle newspapers crumbling at the touch. The headlines were eerily mundane. County Fair opens this weekend. Weather hits record highs. Frozen snapshots of the day he disappeared. The most disturbing discovery was a shoelace, frayed and tied in a knot, wedged beneath the bike's front tire. It was too small to belong to an adult. Forensic techs carefully bagged it, whispering among themselves. The implications were clear. Whoever had sealed Ethan's bike inside this barn had done so deliberately, intending no one to find it. Word reached Charles Walsh that afternoon. Now, in his late 50s, he still lived in the same house, still kept Ethan's bedroom untouched, a shrine of baseball posters and comic books from 1983. When Detective Keating knocked on his door, Charles didn't ask why she'd come. He saw the look in her eyes and simply whispered, "They found something, didn't they?" At the barn, Charles stood silently behind the police tape, staring at the bicycle as if it might speak. It was unmistakably Ethan's. The bent front fender from when he'd crashed into a mailbox, the faded sticker of a rocket ship peeling from the frame. Charles reached out, hand trembling, but a deputy gently stopped him. "We need to preserve it for evidence," the deputy said softly. Charles nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. For 19 years he'd prayed for this day, but seeing the bike felt like losing his son all over again. Detective Keating ordered the entire barn sealed for forensic processing. Every nail, every splinter of wood would be catalogued. Already, questions swirled. Why was Ethan's bike here? Who sealed it inside? And why hadn't the original investigation searched this property thoroughly back in 1983? The Thompson brothers, long gone from Lawson, loomed large in the whispers of townsfolk. Some said they skipped town after a string of thefts. Others claimed they'd died in a bar fight 2 states over. No official record could confirm either story. As dusk fell, crime scene lights bathed the barn in eerie blue. Investigators worked methodically, pulling up floorboards and sifting through hay. Then, just as the last rays of sun dipped below the cornfields, one of the techs called out, "Detective, you're going to want to see this." From a gap in the barn's floorboards, they extracted a small object wrapped in wax paper. Inside was a key, a house key, with the initials CW crudely scratched into the metal. Charles Walsh's initials. In an instant, the case twisted. The discovery of Ethan's bike already promised painful answers, but a key tied to his own father buried alongside it. That raised questions no one in Lawson wanted to ask. The key sat under an evidence light, its tarnished brass catching glints of blue and red from the patrol car lights outside. The crude CW scratched into its side felt like a taunt. Initials everyone in Lawson knew belonged to Charles Walsh. Detective Laura Keating turned the key over carefully in her gloved hand, her mind spinning. The find could mean many things. It could be Ethan's father's key, lost innocently and later buried. It could have been planted, or it could point toward a darker possibility no one wanted to speak aloud. When she approached Charles outside the barn, he was leaning against a patrol car, arms crossed tightly against the night chill. He looked hollow, almost afraid. Laura crouched slightly so her voice wouldn't carry to the other deputies. "Mr. Walsh," she began gently, "we found something else in there, a house key. It has your initials on it." Charles stared at her, blank at first, then his face crumpled. "My house key?" he asked, voice cracking. "From back then? Do you recognize it?" He shook his head. I don't know. I lost one around that time. I always thought Ethan might have picked it up when I dropped it in the yard." Laura studied him. His answer was plausible, but the fact remained. The key was buried with Ethan's bicycle, inside a sealed wall of a barn owned by the notorious Thompson brothers, and those brothers had always been whispered about in connection to Ethan's disappearance. The Thompsons, Dean and Wade, were legends in Lawson, and not in a good way. Rough men in their late 20s back in 1983, they'd run the family farm poorly and drank most of their profits away. They were known for fistfights outside Miller's Tavern, stealing cattle from neighboring ranches, and constantly skirting the law without ever paying real consequences. Rumors swirled that they used the barn for illegal dogfights or storing stolen goods. When Ethan vanished, whispers about the brothers began immediately. The boys' paper route ran right past their property, but during the original investigation, Sheriff Hal Drummond had cleared them quickly, citing lack of evidence. What the public didn't know, and what Laura discovered now in the dusty 1983 case file, was that no search warrant had ever been executed on the Thompson property. The sheriff had simply taken their word that Ethan wasn't around. By the time the barn was finally searched in 2002, the brothers were long gone. Dean had reportedly been killed in a bar fight in Oklahoma. Wade had drifted off the map entirely, last rumored to be working oil rigs in Texas. But now, with Ethan's bicycle literally sealed inside their barn, everything pointed back to them. Still, the presence of Charles's key complicated everything. Laura needed answers, and she needed them carefully. Pushing too hard could alienate the only living parent of the victim. But every cop at the scene felt the same gnawing question. How did his key get there? At the sheriff's office later that night, Laura sat across from Charles in the interview room. A tape recorder hummed softly on the table. "Mr. Walsh," she started, "can you tell me about your relationship with the Thompson brothers?" Charles exhaled sharply. "Didn't have much of one. Worked with them once or twice during harvest. Kept to myself otherwise. Those two were trouble." "Do you remember going to their barn at any point around the time Ethan disappeared?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I searched everywhere after he went missing. Their place included. Sheriff wouldn't give me permission, so I went on my own one night. I didn't find anything." Laura's pen paused mid-scribble. "You trespassed on their property." "I was desperate," Charles admitted quietly. "My boy was gone. I'd have torn the whole county apart if it meant finding him." The confession wasn't incriminating in itself. A frantic father searching for his son was understandable. But it did explain how his key might have ended up there. If he lost it that night, someone could have found it, used it, or planted it. The next day, Laura and her partner, Deputy Collins, began the painstaking process of re-interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the case. 19 years was a long time. Memories had faded. Some witnesses had passed on. Others had left Lawson entirely. First stop, Margaret Ellis, the elderly woman who had been the last confirmed sighting of Ethan in 1983. She still lived in the same farmhouse, hunched over in a rocking chair on her porch. "I remember him clear as day," Margaret said, voice trembling with age. "Came riding by on that little red bike, waved at me like he always did. That boy never missed a paper." "Did you see anyone else on the road that morning?" Laura asked. Margaret hesitated, wrinkling her brow. "I heard a truck. Old engine, loud muffler. Came rumbling past not long after Ethan did. I always figured it was one of the Thompsons. They had that old Ford pickup, remember?" Laura exchanged a glance with Collins. That detail had never been in the original reports. Either Margaret hadn't been asked the right questions back then, or the sheriff had ignored her entirely. Back at the barn, forensic crews made more disturbing discoveries. Behind a second false wall, they uncovered scraps of rope, stained and frayed, buried beneath hay. Chemical tests confirmed faint traces of human blood, too degraded to test in 1983, but now extractable with modern methods. DNA results would take weeks, but everyone knew whose blood it would match. Equally chilling were the scratch marks on the inside of the wooden planks. They were faint, almost lost to time, but unmistakable. fingernail gouges running in frantic arcs across the wood. Standing there, Laura felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just a dumping site. It was a place of struggle, maybe even Ethan's final moments. While searching through old town archives, Laura stumbled across something odd. Property tax records showing the Thompson brothers abruptly sold part of their land 2 months after Ethan's disappearance. The buyer? A shell company linked to the sheriff's cousin. This revelation added a sinister new layer. Had the original investigation been botched, or worse, buried on purpose? Was Sheriff Drummond protecting the Thompsons, or was he involved himself? Laura's gut screamed. There was more to this story than just 2 bad brothers. There was a network of silence, a web that might stretch into the very people sworn to investigate Ethan's disappearance. Meanwhile, Charles's behavior grew more withdrawn. Neighbors whispered that he barely slept, sitting on his porch at night staring toward the Thompson property. Some wondered if he blamed himself. After all, he had forced Ethan to take that paper route to teach him responsibility, despite the boy's protests about the early mornings. Laura noticed it too. When she visited his home to collect old photos of Ethan for the case file, she found the boy's room untouched. Baseball mitt on the bed, comic books stacked neatly on the desk, a calendar frozen on July 1983. In the corner sat a box of unsent letters Charles had written over the years, to police chiefs, journalists, even psychics, begging for help. As Laura closed the door to that room, she understood something chilling. Charles Walsh might be innocent of harming his son, but the guilt of not protecting him had already sentenced him to a lifetime of punishment. The case was opening up like a wound that never healed. Forensic evidence, buried secrets, and long-forgotten witnesses were converging toward something dark, darker than anyone in Lawson was prepared to face. And Laura knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The barn was quiet now, sealed under heavy chains and floodlights that cast eerie shadows over its weathered planks. Detectives worked through the night, combing every inch of the structure. But what unsettled Laura most weren't the obvious clues, the bike, the rope, the scratch marks. It was what was missing. There were no footprints preserved in the dust, no cigarette butts, no personal items left behind. Whoever had used the barn in 1983 had cleaned it carefully before sealing it. That level of preparation didn't sound like 2 drunken farmhands acting on impulse. It sounded deliberate. The lab expedited testing on the blood traces found on the rope. Less than 48 hours later, the results came back. It was Ethan's. That confirmation hit Charles Walsh harder than any speculation ever could. He had always clung to some fragile hope. Maybe his boy had run away. Maybe he was alive somewhere. The moment Laura told him, she saw the last flicker of hope in his eyes extinguish. He sat on his porch steps afterward, staring at nothing, while reporters swarmed the front lawn. For 19 years he had prayed for answers. Now that he had them, they felt like daggers. The investigation's next focus turned toward finding Wade Thompson. Dean was dead, but Wade had a history of disappearing when trouble surfaced. Laura dug through old DMV records, employment logs, even obscure traffic citations across state lines. A hit finally came from Texas. An oilfield worker named Wayne Thomas, arrested in 1991 for public intoxication, matched Wade's fingerprints. No further arrests followed. It was possible he'd changed his name and vanished into transient labor work, the kind of life where no one asked questions and no one cared about past sins. Still, a nagging question lingered in Laura's mind. Why had the sheriff in 1983 never pressed harder on the Thompsons? The more she dug into Hal Drummond's old files, the more inconsistencies she found. A signed search warrant request for the Thompson property. Denied without explanation. witness statements about a truck seen near the paper route, missing from the case file entirely. And then there was the land sale 2 months after Ethan vanished, conveniently transferring part of the Thompson property to the sheriff's cousin. It smelled of something rotten, something more than negligence. Laura visited Drummond's nursing home room 2 days later. The former sheriff was frail, tethered to an oxygen tank, his once imposing frame sunken into the sheets. At first, he denied everything. Denied mishandling the case, denied shielding the Thompsons. But when Laura mentioned the property sale, his eyes flickered with panic. He turned away from her, muttering under his breath about keeping the town safe and deals that had to be made. When she pressed harder, he wheezed out a bitter laugh. "You think you want the truth," he said hoarsely, "but you don't. The truth will burn this town to the ground." The statement rattled Laura, but it also fueled her. Whatever had happened in 1983 wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was covered up by people in power. She needed proof, something irrefutable. The answer, she believed, still lay in that barn. Forensic crews were finishing their sweep when one of them called her over. Beneath the layer of rotting hay, they had found an old floor trap sealed with rusted nails. When they pried it open, a foul smell wafted up, the unmistakable stench of long-buried decay. Inside the shallow compartment were fragments of clothing: denim fabric, a worn sneaker, a newspaper bag strap. But what chilled Laura most wasn't the remains themselves. It was the folded paper tucked beside them, preserved inside a waxy envelope. The paper was yellowed, edges frayed, but Ethan's handwriting was unmistakable. A boy's uneven scrawl. The note was brief, hurried, as if scribbled in terror. "He locked me in. Please tell Dad I didn't do anything wrong." Laura's hands trembled as she read it aloud to Charles later that evening. He broke down completely, sobbing in a way she hadn't seen before. Not quiet tears, but raw, shaking grief. "He thought I'd blame him," Charles whispered. "He died thinking I'd blame him." That night, the case shifted from a mystery to a pursuit. With Ethan's note, blood evidence, and the bike's concealment, it was no longer speculation, it was murder. But the deeper Laura dug, the more she realized this wasn't just about one boy's death. It was about a town that had chosen silence over justice, a sheriff who had buried evidence, and a man still out there, Wade Thompson, who had lived free for nearly 2 decades. And somewhere in Texas or beyond, Wade had no idea the past was about to catch up to him. The search for Wade Thompson began quietly, but spread fast. By the time Ethan's note hit the crime lab, every agency in 3 states had been alerted. Wade had been a ghost for nearly 20 years, living under false names, drifting from job to job. Oil fields in Texas, construction sites in New Mexico, seasonal work in Oklahoma. There were no mortgages, no driver's licenses in his real name, no Social Security filings. But Laura knew one thing about men like Wade: they couldn't run forever. They always left a trail in the small details: a pond watch, a cheap motel stay, a bar fight recorded in a local blotter. 2 days after the barn discovery, that trail surfaced. A construction foreman in El Paso reported a drifter who matched Wade's old mugshot. Same crooked jaw, same snake tattoo on the forearm, working under the alias Wayne Toller. The man had quit abruptly 3 weeks earlier after rumors of unpaid warrants circulated. His last known stop, an abandoned trailer park 30 miles from the border. Laura drove down herself, determined to see the place with her own eyes. The trailer park was sun-bleached and hollow, wind whistling through broken windows. Inside one of the rusting shells, investigators found evidence of Wade's stay: empty beer cans, a sleeping bag, and, most telling of all, a shoebox stuffed with newspaper clippings. They weren't about his crimes. They were about Ethan Walsh. Headlines from 1983 to 2002, meticulously cut and saved, detailing every search, every anniversary vigil, every plea from Charles Walsh. It was as if Wade had been following the family's suffering like a spectator at his own private horror show. Back in Lawson, Charles's grief was curdling into rage. For 19 years he'd been paralyzed by guilt, thinking he'd failed his boy, thinking Ethan might be out there somewhere waiting for him to look harder. Now that the truth was closing in, that guilt twisted into fury. He asked Laura straight out, "If you find him, can I be there? Can I look him in the eye before they take him away?" She didn't answer. The investigation's biggest breakthrough came not from Wade himself, but from the people who had once protected him. Digging deeper into Sheriff Drummond's old files, Laura uncovered sealed depositions from 1983, statements taken but never filed in the official case. One belonged to a farmhand named Rick Torres, who had worked for the Thompsons the summer Ethan disappeared. His statement had been marked inadmissible and buried. When Laura tracked Torres down in Arizona, now an old man, he admitted why. "I saw something that morning," Torres whispered, eyes darting even after decades. "Dean was drunk. Wade was angry. The boy was screaming in the barn. I heard it clear. They told me to keep quiet, said the sheriff already knew and didn't want a circus. Next day they paid me to leave town." "Paid you by who?" Laura pressed. Torres hesitated, then said something that made her blood run cold. "The sheriff himself said it was for my trouble." The implication was staggering. Sheriff Drummond hadn't just been negligent, he had actively silenced witnesses. For years, Lawson's entire law enforcement structure had chosen loyalty and reputation over a murdered child. Laura returned to the nursing home and confronted Drummond again. This time, she brought Torres's testimony and the recovered note. The old man's hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, oxygen tube dangling dangerously close to the flame. "I did what I had to do," he muttered. "Boys like Wade and Dean, they were trash, but they worked half the county's fields. If they went to prison, those farms would have gone under. Whole town would have starved. You let a child die to protect crops." Laura's voice shook with disbelief. Drummond's eyes narrowed. "You think this town's clean? You dig too deep, you'll find everybody's dirty, even your daddy." The remark hit harder than she expected. Laura's father, a mechanic, had worked part-time for the Thompsons in the 80s. She had dismissed it as coincidence, until now. The more she pulled at the threads, the more the case stopped feeling like strangers and started feeling like home. That night, forensic teams completed their excavation of the barn. Beneath the floorboards where Ethan's bike had been hidden, they found more than just his belongings. A shallow pit, crudely dug and sealed, contained skeletal remains. Ropes still bound the small wrists. The boy's skull bore fractures consistent with blunt force, blows from a wooden beam or crowbar. There was no doubt now, Ethan Walsh had died inside that barn, alone and terrified. News of the recovery spread through Lawson like a storm. Candlelight vigils sprang up at the church. People left flowers at the barn fence. But behind the public mourning was an undercurrent of unease, because if Wade Thompson could hide for 19 years, if the sheriff could bury evidence, who else in town had kept their mouth shut? Laura knew this wasn't just about finding Wade anymore. It was about tearing open a wound the entire town had chosen to scar over. And in doing so, she risked uncovering truths that might destroy not just reputations but families, including her own. When the call finally came in, a sighting of Wade hitchhiking near the Texas border, Laura felt something shift. The hunt was no longer abstract. For the first time in 19 years, the boy in the barn might finally have a voice. Rain came down in sheets the night they caught him. A Border Patrol unit had spotted a lone hitchhiker trudging along Highway 20 outside El Paso. Wiry frame, ragged clothes, snake tattoo faded on his left forearm. The patrol car's lights flashed red and blue against the blacktop as agents approached. Wade Thompson didn't run. He just stood there in the rain, hands half raised, eyes empty, as if he'd known this moment was coming for years. They brought him back to Lawson under armed escort. The return of Wade Thompson was like opening a coffin in the middle of town square. Every old wound exposed, every whispered rumor roaring back to life. People lined the streets as the convoy passed, some jeering, some silent, some clutching photographs of a boy frozen in 1983. Charles Walsh stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. For 19 years, he'd imagined this day. Imagined lunging at Wade, imagined screaming questions into his face. But as Wade was led inside in shackles, Charles just stared, hollow and trembling, unable to reconcile the man in front of him with the monster who had taken his son. Inside the interrogation room, Detective Laura Keating sat across from Wade, tape recorder humming softly. He looked older than his 40 years, sunken cheeks, leathery skin from decades of hard labor and hiding, yet his eyes were sharp, calculating. He smiled faintly when Laura slid Ethan's photo across the table. "Long time ago," Wade muttered. "Tell me what happened to him," Laura said quietly. "Why now?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Town didn't care back then. Sheriff didn't care. Everyone knew where that boy ended up. They just didn't want to dig." Laura kept her voice steady. "We dug." She placed the note on the table, Ethan's terrified scrawl. "He locked me in. Please tell Dad I didn't do anything wrong." Wade's eyes flickered, just for a second. "Dean did it," Wade said finally. "My brother. He got drunk, said the kid saw something he shouldn't, locked him in to teach him a lesson." "And you?" "I wasn't there," Wade lied too quickly. "Came back later, too late." Laura leaned forward. "We found your fingerprints on the boards, your blood on the rope. Stop lying to me." Wade's jaw tightened. Dean wanted him quiet. Said the sheriff was already covering for us, no one would look too hard. I told him it was wrong, but Dean didn't listen to anyone. "You expect me to believe you were just an innocent bystander? I expect you to believe I ain't the only one you should be looking at." Wade's gaze sharpened. "You think your daddy's clean? Ask him why he was at the barn that night. Ask him why he didn't say nothing." The words landed like a punch. Laura froze, masking the churn in her gut. Her father had worked for the Thompsons, yes, but the suggestion he'd been there that night, that he'd kept silent for 19 years, it was a possibility she couldn't yet face. Charles Walsh, meanwhile, demanded to confront Wade. Against protocol, Laura allowed it, a desperate father's plea she couldn't deny. In the holding cell, Charles approached the bars slowly, breathing hard. Wade looked up, smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "You took my boy," Charles whispered. "Your boy wandered where he shouldn't," Wade said flatly. "Wasn't my fault." Charles lunged, hands gripping the bars so hard his fingers bled. "Say his name," he hissed. "Say it." "Ethan," Wade said, almost mocking. "Little paper boy with the squeaky bike." The deputies pulled Charles away before the confrontation turned violent. But Laura had seen enough in Wade's eyes to know one thing. He wasn't telling the whole story. He kept deflecting, hinting at others involved, dangling half-truths like bait. He wanted leverage. That night, she revisited the barn with a fresh perspective. Something had nagged at her since the first day. the way the boards had been nailed from the inside, the way Ethan's belongings were arranged. It didn't feel like a sloppy crime of rage. It felt methodical, purposeful. And buried among the debris, forensic techs found a final, chilling clue. A fragment of a uniform button. Not farm overalls, but a sheriff's department button from 1983. Laura stared at it under the evidence light, pulse hammering. The button's design had been discontinued decades ago, issued only during Sheriff Drummond's tenure. The implications were staggering. Wade Thompson might have killed Ethan, but someone in uniform had helped cover it up. The next morning, Laura confronted Drummond one last time. The old man's oxygen hissed with each shallow breath, cigarette trembling between his fingers. "You buried that boy," Laura said, voice low. "You sealed that barn. Why?" Drummond stared at her with milky eyes, a faint smile curling his lips. "Because," he rasped, "sometimes a whole town's sins are heavier than one boy's grave." Before Laura could press further, Drummond's hand slipped, cigarette falling to the floor. A flash, a hiss, the oxygen ignited in an instant. Nurses screamed. Flames licked the curtains as chaos erupted. By the time firefighters extinguished the blaze, the sheriff was gone, taking his secrets with him. But even in death, his words lingered. A whole town's sins. For Laura, the message was clear. This wasn't just about the Thompsons anymore. The rot went deeper, pulling in people she trusted, people she loved. And to uncover the truth about Ethan Walsh, she'd have to burn Lawson's history to the ground. Rain had stopped, but the air inside the interrogation room still felt heavy, thick with the weight of 2 decades of silence. Wade sat shackled to the table, head bowed, damp hair clinging to his temples. For hours he'd stonewalled, deflecting blame to his dead brother, taunting Laura with half-truths. But after the fire at the nursing home, after Sheriff Drummond's death, something shifted. Wade wasn't gloating anymore. He looked scared. Laura dropped a manila folder in front of him, the sound cracking through the silence. Inside were photos. Ethan's bicycle pulled from the barn wall, the shoelace knotted tight, the boy's desperate note. And last, the uniform button, scorched and corroded. "This was found buried with Ethan," Laura said quietly. "From the sheriff's department. Drummond's era. You want to keep blaming your brother, fine. But you and I both know more than one man sealed that barn. Start talking." Wade stared at the button for a long time. Then he laughed, a bitter hollow sound. "You think Drummond was some saint who covered up one crime," he muttered. "That whole town was in on it." Laura didn't flinch. "Explain." "Ethan saw something he wasn't supposed to. That's all this ever was." "What did he see?" Wade leaned forward, eyes cold. "He saw us loading the truck. Not just me and Dean, half the council's boys too. We were moving stolen cattle off Old Man Parker's land. Sheriff knew. Hell, he ran it. Town was broke. Selling beef under the table kept everyone afloat. We'd been doing it for years." Laura's pen froze. "And Ethan? Kid rides up on that squeaky bike middle of the night. Paper route, wrong time, wrong place. He sees us. Dean panics. Starts screaming the kid's gonna tell. Drummond says, 'Handle it quiet.'" "Quiet," Laura repeated. "Means what you think it means," Wade said flatly. "Dean drags the boy into the barn, says it'll just be a scare, lock him in till morning, then talk to his daddy. But," Wade's jaw clenched. "Kid wouldn't stop crying, kept saying he didn't do nothing wrong. Dean snapped, hit him, too hard." Laura's stomach turned. "And you helped hide him." "I nailed the boards," Wade admitted. "Drummond handed me the hammer himself. Said nobody would find him there. Said the boy's daddy would never stop looking, but the rest of the town would forget. And they did. Silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the recorder. Wade's confession wasn't the clean closure she'd hoped for. It was uglier, tangled with the town's own survival. Lawson hadn't just ignored Ethan's murder. It had benefited from it. When Laura stepped outside the interview room, Charles was waiting in the hallway, eyes red-rimmed and raw. He'd overheard enough to know. "They all knew?" he whispered. Laura nodded. "They let me search those fields for months. Let me bury myself in guilt while they all ate stolen beef?" She didn't answer. Some truths had no comfort. The next days were chaos. The media descended on Lawson, digging up every ghost the town had buried. Headlines screamed small-town cover-up, sheriff's office. Implicated in 1983, boy's murder. Former council members were subpoenaed. Old-timers who'd stayed silent suddenly found themselves facing charges for obstruction. Yet one name kept surfacing in whispers: James Keating, Laura's own father. He'd worked part-time for the Thompsons back then. His pickup truck, according to Wade, had been used to move stolen cattle the very night Ethan vanished. Laura confronted him at the auto shop he'd run for 30 years. The moment she stepped inside, she smelled oil and rust and fear. James stood behind the counter, hands blackened from grease, eyes avoiding hers. "Dad," she said, voice trembling. "Where were you the night Ethan Walsh disappeared?" James wiped his hands on a rag, silent. "Wade says you were there," Laura pressed. "He says you helped them." Finally, James met her gaze, tired eyes heavy with a truth he'd carried for 19 years. "I was there," he whispered, "but I didn't hurt that boy." "Then why didn't you come forward?" "Because if I did, they'd have killed me too. Dean, Wade, Drummond. They ran this town like wolves. Everyone was scared. And I thought staying quiet would keep you safe." Laura's throat tightened. Safe from what? James hesitated, glancing toward the back office where old boxes of paperwork sat gathering dust. "You don't understand, Laura. Ethan wasn't their only victim." Her breath caught. "There were others," James said. "And some of them, they were never found." That night, Laura pored over forgotten files and missing persons reports, cross-referencing every unexplained disappearance from the 80s and 90s. A pattern emerged: farmhands, drifters, a girl from the next county over. All vanished near Thompson property. All cases quietly closed. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Ethan's murder wasn't an isolated crime. It was the only one anyone ever cared enough to notice. And if Wade was telling the truth, the real question wasn't just who killed Ethan Walsh. It was how many graves were hidden beneath Lawson's soil. The next morning, Laura drove alone to the Thompson property, headlights cutting through heavy fog that clung low to the fields. The barn was still taped off, a skeletal monument to the town's guilt. But Laura wasn't there for the barn, not this time. Wade's confession and her father's trembling admission pointed to something bigger. The map she'd pieced together overnight showed patterns: livestock theft rings, missing drifters, cash moving quietly through council hands. Ethan had simply been the wrong witness at the wrong time. She stepped through mud and weeds to the edge of the property, where the ground dipped into a dry creek bed. Surveyors marking the land for auction had flagged odd depressions weeks earlier, assuming they were animal burrows. But Laura knew better. She requested ground-penetrating radar, and what came back chilled everyone: 6 anomalies, evenly spaced just beyond the barn's south wall. The dig began at sunrise. Deputies and respirators unearthed the first set of remains by noon: a shallow grave, bones bound with rope. The second grave held similar remains. By dusk, 4 graves had been uncovered, each one older than Ethan's, each a silent witness to a pattern no one wanted to admit. This barn had been a burial ground long before 1983. News crews swarmed the property, hungry for spectacle. But Laura stood apart, sickened. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Lawson hadn't just failed Ethan Walsh. It had devoured its own. That night, she drove to confront her father. James Keating sat on the porch, cigarette trembling between his fingers, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He didn't look surprised to see her. "They found them, didn't they?" he said quietly. "How many did you know about?" Laura demanded. "I knew about Ethan," James whispered, "and I heard rumors about the others. I never saw their faces, never wanted to." "Why didn't you speak up?" James stared at her, voice cracking. "Because the sheriff said if anyone talked, families would pay. He had men everywhere, Laura, even at church, even at the school. There was nowhere safe." "And you believed him?" James met her gaze with something like shame. "I had you to protect." Meanwhile, Wade was arraigned in county court, charged with Ethan's murder and multiple counts of accessory to other homicides. The courtroom was packed. Locals clutching photographs, reporters shouting questions. The Walsh family seated stiffly in the front row. When Wade entered in shackles, the room buzzed with murmurs. Laura watched him carefully. He looked gaunt but defiant, as if daring the town to pretend they hadn't been complicit. During the hearing, his public defender requested a plea deal in exchange for full disclosure of all co-conspirators. The judge, grim-faced, granted a conditional agreement. That afternoon, Wade began talking, really talking. He named names. Old council members, farmhands, even a retired pastor who'd looked the other way. And then he dropped the name Laura dreaded most. "James Keating was there the night Ethan died," Wade said calmly. "He didn't swing the hammer, but he held the door." The words sucked the air from the room. Laura felt heat rush to her face. She wanted to shout, to deny, but deep down, something in her father's haunted silence had already told her it was true. Later that evening, Laura confronted James one last time. He didn't deny it. "I didn't hurt him," James said, tears streaking his dirt-stained cheeks. "But I stood there. I watched them lock that boy in. I told myself I couldn't stop it. I was a coward." "Why didn't you come forward when Dean died, when Wade ran?" Laura's voice trembled with anger and grief. "Because silence was the only thing keeping you safe," James whispered. "If I opened my mouth, they'd have buried us too." Laura stared at him, torn between duty and blood. Her badge weighed heavy on her chest. "I have to take you in," she said finally. James nodded, almost relieved. "I know." As deputies led her father away, Laura stood alone on the porch, the weight of 2 decades crashing down on her. She had solved Ethan's murder, uncovered the hidden graves, exposed the town's rot. But at a cost she hadn't anticipated, because the truth hadn't just destroyed Lawson. It had destroyed her family. And yet, somewhere in the wreckage, one question still gnawed at her. If Ethan had only seen stolen cattle, why bury so many bodies in the same place? The exhumations continued for days. Each grave yielded fragments of rope, cloth, and bone, men and women no one in Lawson remembered, their lives erased long before Ethan's. Forensic reports revealed something chilling. 3 of the skeletons bore fractures identical to Ethan's, blunt force trauma to the skull. Another was bound at the ankles, consistent with restraint. The pattern wasn't just accidental, it was ritual. The FBI was called in. Federal jurisdiction shifted the case beyond Ethan Walsh's murder to a broader inquiry. Organized theft, illegal labor, and human trafficking in rural farm networks through the 70s and 80s. It was a story bigger than Lawson, bigger than the Thompsons, and for Laura, it was personal. In the midst of this chaos, Wade Thompson finally broke completely. During a late-night debrief, he confessed details Laura hadn't anticipated, details that reframed everything. "You think it was about cattle?" he scoffed, slumped in chains. "That was just a side hustle. The real money was in people. Migrant kids, runaways, cheap hands no one'd miss." Laura's stomach turned. "You're telling me the Thompsons were selling them," Wade interrupted. "To farms, factories, even mines downstate. Sheriff knew, council knew, everybody got a cut. And Ethan? He saw them loading a girl into that truck," Wade said quietly. "She was screaming. Dean panicked, said Ethan would talk. Sheriff said they couldn't afford that kind of heat, so they shut him up." The missing girl's file surfaced 2 days later. Marisol Ortega, age 15, vanished from the next county weeks before Ethan. Her parents had begged for help back then. The sheriff's office had shrugged them off. Her remains were never found among the graves, leading Laura to suspect something worse. Marisol had been sold, not killed. The town's reaction to these revelations was split. Some were horrified, demanding justice. Others, older families who'd quietly profited from the stolen cattle and cheap labor, grew defensive, muttering about digging up the past and ruining Lawson's name. Vigilantes began leaving threats on Laura's doorstep, accusing her of tearing the community apart. Through it all, Charles Walsh remained silent. He'd gotten his answer, but closure was hollow. Sitting on his porch at dusk, he clutched Ethan's rusted bike, rocking gently, whispering his son's name. Laura visited him one evening. "We're going to trial," she said softly. Charles didn't look up. "You think that'll fix it? It's justice." "Justice?" Charles spat. "For 19 years they lied. For 19 years they ate Sunday dinners, went to church, raised their kids, while mine rotted under their floorboards. There's no justice for that." His words hung heavy. Laura knew he was right. No sentence, no verdict could undo what Lawson had done. In the weeks that followed, Wade's testimony unraveled every secret Lawson had buried. He implicated former deputies, councilmen, even a school principal who'd recruited runaway teens for farm work. Arrests rippled through the county like aftershocks. But amid the chaos, one truth still haunted Laura. Who sealed the barn? Wade swore it was Dean. James Keating admitted he watched but didn't act. Drummond's button proved law enforcement involvement. But the boards themselves, nailed from the inside, told a different story. Someone had been in there with Ethan. Someone who'd left no trace but a child's desperate note. Late one night, Laura returned to the barn alone. She traced the gouges in the wood, the frantic arcs of fingernails. Her flashlight beam swept across a beam she'd seen 100 times, and froze. Faintly scratched into the timber, beneath layers of dust, were initials. Not CW, not WT, JK. Her breath caught. Her father's initials. Laura sat in her car for a long time outside the auto shop, hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring at the faint initials she had traced on her notepad. JK. Her father's initials, carved inside the barn where Ethan Walsh had died. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Yet it explained everything Wade had hinted at, everything Drummond had taunted her with before the fire. When she finally stepped inside, the shop was silent except for the hum of a single overhead bulb. James Keating stood at the workbench, wiping grease from his hands, as if waiting for her. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he looked relieved. "You found it," he said softly. Laura's voice trembled. "You were in the barn." James nodded once. "I was there." "You carved your initials." "I didn't mean to," he whispered. I don't even know why I did it. Maybe I wanted someone to know I'd been there, even if I couldn't say it out loud." Laura's throat tightened. "Tell me what happened." James's story spilled out in fragments, halting and raw. He'd been 23 then, working for the Thompsons under the table. That night, he said, they'd been moving stolen cattle, routine, nothing unusual, when Ethan Walsh rode up on his paper route, flashlight cutting through the dark. "Dean lost it," James said, voice cracking. "Grabbed the boy, dragged him into the barn. Wade tried to calm him down, said the kid wouldn't tell. But Dean was drunk, paranoid. He kept yelling about loose ends." Sheriff Drummond showed up minutes later. Instead of stopping it, he told us to handle it. James looked down at his hands, knuckles white. "I wanted to leave. I swear to God I wanted to run. But Drummond said if I walked, I'd end up in the ground next to the boy." "So you helped them," Laura said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't hit him," James said quickly. "I didn't touch him. Dean did that. But after—" He swallowed hard. "After Ethan stopped moving, Drummond said we had to hide him. He made me hold the boards while Wade nailed them. He said if we buried him there, no one would ever look. Why didn't you come forward later, when Dean died, when Wade disappeared?" James's eyes filled with tears. Because Drummond wasn't lying. This town was in on it. The council, the deputies, even the church. They all knew about the theft ring, about the kids they took for labor. If I talked, it wouldn't just be me. It would have been you, Laura. They'd have come after you to shut me up. I stayed quiet to keep you safe." Laura shook her head, trembling. "Safe? You let a 13-year-old boy rot in a wall. You watched his father tear himself apart for 19 years. James's voice broke. "I know. Every day since I've known." Laura drew her service weapon, hands shaking. "You're under arrest," she said quietly. James didn't flinch. "I figured this was coming," he murmured. "Do me one favor, Laura. Don't let them make me the only villain. Tell the truth about all of them." She cuffed him silently, tears blurring her vision. Outside, deputies waited, not just for James, but for Wade's transport, for evidence logs, for the endless paperwork that would follow. But Laura knew the case wasn't over, because there was one last loose thread. Ethan's note. "He locked me in. Please tell Dad I didn't do anything wrong." Wade swore Dean locked the boy in. James said Wade did the nailing. Drummond claimed to have ordered it, but the scratches inside the boards, the angle, the height, suggested something else entirely. The person sealing the barn had been inside with Ethan, and that meant the boy hadn't died alone. Back at the evidence locker, Laura re-examined the recovered note. The paper's edges were frayed, stained with dirt and blood, but under magnification a faint smudge appeared in the corner. Not dirt, not blood. Graphite, as if another hand had tried to erase something before the final message was written. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The erased line read, faint but unmistakable. "He said Dad would forgive us." Laura stared at the words numb, us, not me. There had been more than one child in that barn. The next morning, federal agents unearthed the last grave by the creek bed. It wasn't Ethan. It was Marisol Ortega, the missing girl from the next county, bound the same way, same fracture pattern. Laura stood at the edge of the pit, wind whipping her hair, stomach twisting. For 20 years, Lawson had buried its sins. Now they were clawing to the surface all at once. In 48 hours, Wade Thompson would testify in open court. James Keating would face charges. The entire town council would be dragged into the light. And Charles Walsh would finally learn the full scope of the conspiracy that stole his son. But Laura knew one truth above all others. When the truth came out, Lawson itself might not survive. The courthouse overflowed that morning, reporters jostling for position, families clutching faded photographs, federal agents stationed at every exit. For the first time, Lawson would hear the full truth about the boy who vanished on his paper route in 1983. Charles Walsh sat in the front row, hands gripping the brim of his hat, face pale and hollow. He had lived 19 years in limbo, clinging to hope, drowning in guilt. Now, he was about to learn what really happened to his son, and who had stood silent while it did. Laura Keating took the stand first. Her voice trembled only once as she recounted the investigation. The bike sealed in the barn wall, the scratch marks, the hidden graves. She named every name Wade Thompson had given: the Thompsons, the councilman, the deputies, the sheriff himself. And finally, her own father. Gasps rippled through the courtroom when she described finding J.K. carved inside the barn. James Keating sat shackled at the defense table, head bowed, tears streaking his weathered face. "He didn't kill Ethan," Laura said quietly, "but he was there, and he stayed silent." Then Wade Thompson took the stand. Shackled, unshaven, he stared down the packed courtroom with defiance and resignation in equal measure. His testimony painted the full picture: the theft ring, the trafficking, the sheriff's orders, and at the heart of it, a terrified 13-year-old boy who stumbled onto something too big for him to understand. "Dean hit him," Wade said flatly. "Too hard. The kid was crying, begging. Sheriff said to shut him up, keep it quiet, so we did." "And the barn?" the prosecutor asked. "We sealed him in. Sheriff's idea. Said the town didn't need a scandal." Wade's voice softened for the first time. "Kid kept saying, 'Tell my dad I didn't do anything wrong.' Over and over, like he thought someone would believe him." Wade hesitated, then added something he'd never told anyone. "When we were nailing the boards, the kid looked at me, right at me, and he said, 'Tell my dad I forgive him.'" The courtroom fell silent. Even Charles, who had sat stone-faced through every gruesome detail, broke down then. Silent sobs racking his frame as he buried his face in his hands. The verdicts came swiftly. Wade Thompson, guilty of murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, life without parole. James Keating, accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, 10 years reduced for cooperation. Former councilmen and deputies faced their own reckoning in federal court. But no sentence felt like enough. No prison term could balance 19 years of silence, of stolen lives and hidden graves. After the trial, Laura walked Charles to the barn one last time. The crime scene tape was gone. Only splintered boards and churned earth remained. They stood in silence until Charles knelt, placing a single paper on the ground. One of Ethan's old route maps, yellowed and creased from decades in his wallet. "He forgave me," Charles whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know how, but he forgave me." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe that's why we found him," she said softly. "So you could hear it." Months later, the barn was torn down. In its place, the community erected a simple memorial. A red bicycle cast in bronze, wheels forever frozen mid-turn. Ethan Walsh's name etched below. Every July, people gathered there, not just to remember Ethan, but all the others Lawson had lost to its silence. For Laura, the case left scars she would carry forever. She'd put her own father in prison, exposed the rot beneath the town she once called home. But she'd also given a boy back his name, his story, his voice. And in the quiet that followed, as wind whispered through the empty fields, Laura imagined Ethan's words echoing one last time, not from fear, but from peace. "Tell Dad I didn't do anything wrong."